Okay, let's see. It's hard to tell if people are back or not because they haven't been putting their screens on, but it is 10:25. So
Let's go.
we're going to jump right back in. And now we're moving to talk about carbon management on the farm, developing a business case. And we have co-presenters today, Tim Baye and Sara Walling. Tim is a professor of business development and a state energy specialist with the University of Wisconsin-Madison, the Division of Extension. His research and educational programs serve energy industry executives, professionals, and policy leaders. He has over 30 years experience in industrial renewable energy projects and policy, in education, executive and advisory capacities. Baye has a bachelor's degree in marketing and economics from UW Green Bay, a master's degree from Marquette University and the University of Kentucky. Oh, 2 master's degrees, sorry about that, and conducted postgraduate work at the UW-Madison. Sara serves as the agricultural policy manager at the Alliance for the Great Lakes. Sara brings to her role at the Alliance over 15 years of technical and policy development experience in agricultural nutrient management, water quality, and bioenergy while at the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection. Additionally, Sara served as the Agriculture Institute Director at the UW-Madison Division of Extension, where she oversaw county extension agents and agricultural education and outreach programs. Sara has a Master of Science in Land Resources and Environmental Sciences from Montana State University in Bozeman, and a Bachelor of Science in Natural Resources and Water Quality from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. So I'm going to turn it over to Tim and Sara.
Great. Let's see if I can get my slideshow going. So good morning, everybody. Thanks for having us on, and we're glad to be able to participate in the workshop today and add a little context around our climate smart commodities, carbon management on the farm, and how we can develop a business case around that. Initially, I'm going to start off the presentation, and Tim and I are going to kind of bounce back and forth. So right off the bat, I think some of you at least might be wondering why the Alliance for the Great Lakes has a stake in a talk like this for today. And I think, one of the main things you probably got from Diane and also Brian's discussions are, when we talk about carbon management and in the context of what I'll be covering today and agricultural soils, there's a lot of co-benefits to be reaped. So personally at the Alliance, and my personal objective in a lot of this is I'm here for the water quality and soil health improvements in a lot of ways. And the business case and credit development and carbon storage kind of goes along with that, but I'm pretty agnostic relatively to how we accomplish those water quality goals. And so a lot of what we'll be covering today kind of has those dual effects and benefits, and you'll hear that woven throughout. The other part is certainly a little bit selfish in that we've been working on this kind of carbon and climate policy and how it relates to forestry and agricultural industries for quite some time. And so we want to be able to move the ball, and it's very exciting for initiatives that started 15 years ago, especially with our renewable portfolio at Standard, et cetera, in the state, to be really taking, moving the ball forward in the last several years, and with a lot of the things we hear about today and motivating factors. So tons of external drivers, tons of internal drivers for why you would look to U.S. agriculture for carbon management and sustainability initiative areas. The first Diane covered briefly, so I won't spend too much time in it, but Wisconsin's greenhouse gas emissions by sector, you can see that agriculture has increased. It's that kind of reddish pie up on the top left a little bit on each of those. And it's gone up a fair bit since the 2005 baseline to the 2018. So people are paying attention to that. Agriculture industry is paying attention to that. And I think that also indicates that there's room for movement in that area and reductions to be had. As Diane also covered, main 2 areas that we have a lot of control over, and we'll be covering mostly today, is going to be on the ag soils piece and how you can use those soils to actually sequester rather than emit, ideally, and then of course manure management, et cetera. So there's certainly other dials that we could be turning within agriculture, and a lot of what Tim will cover in our talk is going to build in the multifaceted whole farm system approach.
And Sara, just if you go back one slide real quickly.
Sure.
For those of you who are familiar with Wisconsin, with the World Resource Institutes, these are Scope 1 emissions originating from an agricultural operation. We'll pick it up later. Thanks.
Yep. Feel free to interject at any point in that, and I'll probably turn to you a little bit, Tom or Tim, too, and you can kind of jump in. Consumer expectations are certainly a huge driver these days. The more that you are on social media and the internet, the more you're seeing everything from more farm to fork kind of initiatives. People are interested in understanding where their food comes from. Millennials in particular are making up a big portion of our population base, moving into making very critical decisions about how they spend their dollars, how they invest their money, et cetera. And that in turn drives processor decisions. So everything from the illustration you have here is from the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef Production, working toward their sustainability objectives, and then recognition across all sectors that sustainability is going to really be a top industry trend moving forward. The reason I like this, and I kind of harken back to what I initially said, is 10, 15 years ago when we were first talking about carbon markets, everybody got very excited about a lot of things. We had a lot of then energy price crashes, et cetera. And there's just a lot of factors that weighed into the lack of a ton of movement in the space 15 years ago when we were first starting this in Wisconsin and setting up our renewable portfolio standards, et cetera. So this indicates longevity to me. It indicates longevity to the agricultural industry and certainly the food processing companies that go hand in hand with that production. Certainly on the farm, and taking it from that farm and environmental perspective in the next few slides, you'll also see that there's been a ton of volatility. This is just one graphic on the volatility of nitrogen fertilizer sources over time. But you can see a huge spike. This is from 2011 to 21, the December of 21. A lot of volatility over that time, but also most recently a huge price spike in what the input costs are for agricultural production at this point. So that's a driver in itself to reduce the amount of inputs needed. And you can do that in a number of ways, not just by cutting back on that actual rate of fertilizer, but maximizing efficiencies on the farm, et cetera. The other thing about that too is some of that volatility, I guess I would also add in that applies also to a lot of other inputs on the farm, either equipment costs, land rental rates, and purchasing rates. Those have all been hugely volatile and for the most part really ramping up in cost. And so keeping in mind, I guess, that farm margins are pretty slim all the way around. That's a lot of the reason why you have we're seeing a lot of farms going bankrupt or just going out of business, choosing not to continue in production these days. And so all of those factors are weighing in. So the concept of carbon markets, carbon management, and meeting ESG goals for processors can be a big financial driver for farms also. Also importantly, and coming back to the GHG emissions issues and climate change, it has its own impacts on agricultural production. So this is for Wisconsin, obviously. This is from the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts, which I'm a part of the agricultural working group for that organization. Indicating how much hotter the summers are going to get. So volatility around drought is certainly something to be considerate of, and yield losses associated with that, and supply chain risks as a piece of that as well. Also, Wisconsin is going to be actually fairly blessed with more precipitation likely over time. And while that at times can be a challenge with, certainly having some big erosion events, issues of nutrient losses, et cetera. So environmental constraints that come with and challenges that come with some of that, especially if they're really high intensity precipitation events. The other piece that does come with it though is we're blessed with water. As you're watching a lot of other parts of the country, certainly in the United States, but also globally be impacted by really severe, long stints of drought and water access issues, the pressures that Wisconsin agriculture is going to continue to face it's just going to ramp up over the next several decades as more and more pressure for food production moves north and into areas like ours that will continue to have access to the water necessary to grow a good, healthy stand of crops. The other piece of that is certainly we have growing season lengths are increasing, again, putting more pressure on it relative to pests and other disease issues that are, really cold winters can help alleviate at times, and with the lack of those. So there's just a lot of challenges working within agriculture as it is with all of these conditions. But it does really put more pressure and more impetus on agriculture to do more to both affect its ability to adapt to climate change, but also sort of as a mitigation strategy. Tim.
Sir, hold on to the following thought. If you're a commodity producer and you're looking at increased participation and the more extreme weather events, you have to begin to factor into your production planning and your cropping systems multiple passes, an increase of X times amount of diesel usage, the loss of effectiveness or efficacy of post-emergent applications of fertilizers and etc. There are all kinds of risk factors that also are embedded at the enterprise, at the farm level, not just the farm's impact on the climate, but the climate's impact on the farm. And we'll cover
Absolutely.
some of that.
Which comes back to, this much longer list than all the few that I picked out to kind of cover with a few illustrations. But to Tim's point, a lot of that risk management and the cost of capital is a big component. And as I can't reiterate enough that the margins on farms are already very slim. And so in that case, there's just not a lot of room to be able to absorb that kind of risk over time. There's a lot of state and federal programs, which we'll go into a little bit further on in our discussion, that can help also drive these types of practices that Diane actually walked us through a fair bit of, relative to what farms can be doing on their landscapes right now to be sequestering more carbon, storing more carbon, and reducing their emissions. But I would say, you'll hear this theme from me as I sprinkle in through a lot of the rest of the talk too, is that we as a state and a nation have been funneling incentive dollars into farm-based conservation programs for a long, long time. Yet we still continue to have water quality issues and really are moving the ball very far and improving the water quality in our nation's surface and groundwater sources. So looking at how we can use the funding differently and really take this from, kind of baby steps into more of a marathon toward better carbon management, but certainly the climate change impacts alleviation that come with that. Certainly there, along with that, there's going to be increases in technology that's accessible to agriculture to handle a lot of these things. And so that's a huge piece. And then a lot of what Tim, and I'll pass the next slide over to him to start, is looking at the enterprise scale opportunities and a recognition that we're not really just talking on a farm management system associated with the carbon markets and ESGs, et cetera, that we'll go into today. And you'll hear more about throughout the rest of the day, that there are really whole farm opportunities to look at carbon management across all the aspects of the farm and really gain additional opportunities for profitability, efficiency, et cetera, through those processes. So Tim, I'll pass it to you and just to let me know when you need me to advance the slides.
All right, next slide. All right, so the premise of this presentation is how to build a business case at the farm. And in order to build a business case, you have to understand and be able to internalize what the value proposition of managing carbon is. There are two primary markets for environmental attributes, which a carbon credit falls into definition of an environmental attribute. The compliance and regulated markets have always been the driver in this space. They were first, it's the renewable energy credits that were associated with renewable energy, and they were things that utilities had to measure and report. Increasingly, since the development of the renewable fuel standard at the federal level and the low carbon fuel standard at the California market, transportation, biofuel markets have also had assigned to them environmental attributes. These attributes are created when either the power or the fuel is produced. They're assigned to that batch and they follow that batch, just like a blockchain, all the way through from the production to the final consumption. As Sara also mentioned, there has been the emergence of the voluntary markets. And there have been voluntary markets for sustainability practices for quite some time. A lot of them are the voluntary practices that were supported by cost sharing in the ag bills. What's emerged in the last 10 markets are voluntary corporate markets. And these have been to a large part driven by national and international agreements. One of the best known applications for these voluntary markets is ESG, environmental, societal, and governance programs at corporate entities. These are defined objectives and practices that major companies wouldn't, and a lot of them are processors, have adopted and are now subject to a fair amount of review and regulation. Next slide, please. Let's start at the farm. You got a toolkit. Now, what appears here is derived from a whole series of different sources, but was utilized in the development of Wisconsin program. We'll expand on it in a little bit. There are six fundamentals. You've got to account for your carbon and the carbon accounting systems. This is a space that is increasing in its activity, the volume of participants, its complexity on an increasing rate. Just this morning, a colleague from Iowa State, I saw released a carbon management tool for on-farm decision-making. A year ago, I started getting involved in some of the climate smart commodity proposals for USDA. And in that year period of time, the world of carbon accounting has dramatically changed, almost to a point where an intermediary needs to step in, and the Securities and Exchange Commission is just about to do that. Well, beyond the carbon accounting, what are tools? All too often in my participation in discussions about agriculture and natural-based solutions, the discussion gravitates to soil carbon almost immediately, and for good reason. It's a controversial topic. There are lots of leaders. We're going to hear speakers from others, and I respect and commend them for their leadership in this space, but it's only one aspect of a farming operation. Farms also consume power, consume fuels, have nutrient management practices, and can contribute directly to carbon offset and carbon credit generation through agreements with other providers, marketers. But it's not just about soil carbon. It's about many aspects of running a business, and we're going to explore and peel that back a bit. Sara? The National Milk Producer Federation zeroes in on 4 different topics. They look at feed production and practices, manure handling and nutrient management, cow care and the efficiency of an operation, and then the on-site energy use. Sara? So where does this information come from? Well, as you can see in the illustration here, there are 6 types of sources: the herd profile and the beef and milk production, energy use and the sources of that energy. And keep in mind, that's not just power. That also includes propane for drying crops, transportation embedded in bringing inputs to the farm and taking product away from the farm, where your feed, what type of rations you're using, how do you manage your nutrients, and all the trucking and staffing related, what's embedded into the vendors that support your farm, the suppliers. All of these may be small, but aggregated, they represent the carbon footprint of the operation. That carbon footprint, the terminology that's used in the marketplace is carbon intensity. It's basically the carbon footprint divided by the output, or the inverse, depending on who's asking for the information. This information, most of this information isn't new. It's out there, it's available from traditional sources of information, but it takes a concerted effort at the farm level to collect and analyze it. Excellent. Excellent.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's a really good point to make, though, too, because it also, I think, sets up an opportunity for some farms to just be better situated to be able to take on some of this effort than others, where they're already, gathering this information. Certainly growers that already have direct contracts to food processors, et cetera, are already providing or needing to capture some of this information. But for some sectors of agriculture, it would be a very new, level of sophistication to take on, to be measuring and recording and tracking all of this at the farm level.
All right, so external influences. USDA Climate Smart Commodity. There are 141 projects. I'm involved in one that's headquartered in the state of Wisconsin. And the specific intent of this funding isn't just to support practice changes. There will be a lot of that. It's the majority of the money is going toward. But embedded in every one of these is to investigate and prove out methods and approaches, what's the most practical way for farming operations to assess their carbon footprint, manage their carbon footprint, and benefit from doing so. The Inflation Reduction Act and the IIJA, the Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act, are game changing. I woke up one morning and saw that Manchin and Schumer had drank 2 bottles of tequila and came up with this massive bill because nobody saw it coming. And embedded in the Inflation Reduction Act are significant funds and incentives for agriculture. But really, what's probably one of the biggest game changers in this space is the Securities Exchange Commission on Financial Disclosures required for ESG. These rules aren't out yet. We're expecting them within the next few weeks. They've been highly contentious. But what they will do is they will clarify what are the disclosure requirements for carbon accounting. How much, to what extent, what types of science-based information, what kind of documentation will have to back up the claims being made by the companies filing these reports. And in my opinion, and I think the opinion of most in the climate finance world, these are very necessary to regulate this marketplace, and most importantly, to instill trust in the greater public and the financial markets. Next slide. Peel back the IRA a bit. There is 18 billion from IRA, and most of it will go through traditional conservation sources, EQIP being the largest of all of them. Next slide, please. Well, we probably could have dropped this slide, but that basically representing the same on the apportion. You'll see EQIP is a program that most of the agricultural sector, and I know lots of Wisconsin, is very familiar with. Every NRCS office has had a track record in doing so, and it provides a degree of security and familiarity to the farming community that, okay, this is how we touch this program. This is how we interact with the funding sources and the regulators in deploying and executing any projects that we may be being asked by our processors to consider.
I guess to add to that too, these 4 programs that are highlighted on this slide are really the bread and butter of federal support for conservation on farms for the involuntary incentive-based practice implementation. So EQIP is certainly one of the biggest ones for Wisconsin that we've been using for decades, certainly within agriculture. It pays for things like manure storage lagoons, grassed waterways, but practice by practice based projects that are funded as a cost share mechanism from the federal government. So interestingly, that so much money is going into the IRA fund moving forward. Hugely excited about it. It's about several 4 to 5 times more than we've ever gotten in a federal appropriation for this kind of effort in history. So to Tim's point, it's a shocker, game changer for sure. But also interesting that it's funneled into some very traditional programs. So we're interested and happy to see that the USDA is very interested in understanding how the rest of the country, agriculture, environmental groups feel like those dollars should be spent and how we can really do more. I think it really allows us to think and pull out some crazy ideas about where these dollars could go to support agricultural conservation initiatives on a more whole farm level too, than just the piecemeal project by project base that we've been used to funding at, which I think is on the agriculture environmental component side is a really big benefit and a really great opportunity that I hope we don't lose sight of as these dollars continue to funnel their way into some of these traditional programs, hopefully with some untraditional uses moving forward.
The Commodity Smart program was put together, and the reception was overwhelming. There were over 425 applications for the large project portion of this program, which, if they all capped out at their max, was about $200 billion of ask. That's a lot of money. And I think it took USDA a little bit by surprise on the extent and the scale of interest. Next slide, please. I'm going to discuss a little bit in particular my contribution to the Edge Dairy and Nature Conservancy project that's focused primarily in Wisconsin, but touches, I think, 7 different states. My contribution is to act to manage the Climate Finance Governance Board. What's the Climate Finance Governance Board? It's a big shout out to the science community and the ag technical service providers is, hey, you have our attention. Now, please work with us on a bipartisan way. And I don't mean that politically ways. I mean, from finance talking to science for science to listen to finance. And the finance community saying, okay, you have us, you had us at hello. Now, this is the science that we need in order to create fungible, trusted, liquid carbon credits that are directly tied to practices and investments at the farm level. So, and our role is to take the SEC and the EU disclosure regulations, boil them down, and develop them into a tool that's embedded into the farming plants, so that the farm then can consider at execution what in fact they're going to be generating in terms of carbon offsets, carbon credits, and how then they can utilize that carbon credit to benefit their own operation. Now, one of the problems with a lot of the existing systems right now is they're not place-based. There's not enough information available that would allow for a next crop of corn on this ground with this tillage practice in my neighborhood. That information has to be extrapolated from broad geographical averages. There's not enough information about what's the carbon intensity of the kilowatt hour I buy, or what's the carbon intensity of the diesel or the propane I buy, or what's the carbon intensity of the transport of my milk from my farming operation to the processor. All of these are types of data that need to be developed and are transparent in their origin, so that the resulting carbon credits that are generated from farming practices are trusted, just like soil carbon practices and soil carbon credits, that they're trusted. Because without the trust in the marketplace, these places, that they don't have value, or they have less value, because then they're relying on private contracts. Nothing wrong with private contracts in my mind, but that's a very limited form. Our intent and the intent of the Climate Smart Commodity Program is to create a system where carbon credits are originated on the farm, are registered on the farm, and are basically a product of the farmer, that they can then retire them to reduce their own carbon intensity and their own carbon footprint, or they can transfer them, sell them to somebody else who in fact is going to use them as an offset to reduce their carbon footprint. But there's no clearinghouse for this right now. Vast majority of carbon contracts are done privately. And our contribution to Climate Smart Project is to try to change that, so they can be traded on the Board of Trade or NYMEX or other trading platforms. Next slide, please.
So Tim just talked a lot about some very very expensive influxes of dollars and programs from the federal level that are influencing agriculture's carbon management systems and our path toward increased sustainability. I covered initially a lot of the other drivers that would be pushing farms to look more to their carbon footprints and climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies. There are, importantly, there's, while I would say, not leading the pack as far as the state goes with setting really aggressive targets and setting up new programs financially or otherwise to be able to support farmers to do more and more and more. I think we have a lot of great programs that have existed and are still, functioning and have great models for how some of this can work. And I wanted to just peel that over for you a little bit. So certainly alternative compliance mechanisms by wastewater treatment plants and other industrial sources of water discharges is certainly become a driver. Phosphorus standards for our surface water bodies were put in place about 10 years ago, and putting those caps on the amount of phosphorus that can be discharged from industrial and wastewater treatment sources has created an opportunity for more partnerships to advance between those sources and the non-point source world of agriculture. And the map that you're seeing here is the most recent of all the adaptive management and water quality trading transactions that have happened or are in process of happening right now. We also have had a big driver recently for agriculture itself to kind of take notice because of the targeted maximum daily load efforts. So that's kind of a pollution diet for a watershed to say how much phosphorus and suspended solids can be discharged into a water body and have it still be fishable, swimmable, drinkable, etc. And so that has been a big driver for agriculture as well, because what it does say is, well, we don't have a lot of, the Clean Water Act doesn't provide a lot of regulatory oversight to non-point sources, which are the agricultural sources of water quality pollution. These kinds of TMDLs do put in a structure for how much agriculture should be allowed to have runoff of their fields, et cetera, to still obtain the water quality attributes that we're looking for in our watersheds. And so these efforts have kind of put a little bit of a spotlight on how much runoff can be allowed by agricultural operations and their fields. And so putting a little bit more pressure on agriculture to do more with their own land base to mitigate some of those issues. One of the places that I think we've seen a lot of good progress within agriculture is through the DATCAP Producer-Led Watershed Protection Grant Program. You'll notice here, though, in comparison to the levels of funding that Tim and I just uncovered with the IRA, et cetera, we are talking a drop in the bucket as far as what the state has been financially contributing to the cost share initiative effort compared to the federal levels of spending. However, the producer-led program is a great incubator opportunity to be able to share insights and knowledge across farms within a somewhat constrained watershed type of boundary. And it really, what I think it does the most for is that peer-to-peer communication across farms to be able to understand who's participating in things like a climate smart program or a carbon, that kind of thing, but also, understanding what kind of Diane was covering on, like use of cover crops and use of other crop management and nutrient management strategies. That's not as easy of a lift as it makes it sound. And I know from having crossed over from the agricultural realm into the environmental NGO world, there's a lot of assumption that it should be very straightforward for farmers just to be able to start adding cover crops, push over to no-till, et cetera. And what comes with that is a lot of technical challenges due to a lot of variability and a lot of factors that hit farms throughout the course of a growing season. And so getting the farmers over those hurdles of incorporation of those practices into their crop management systems is a really big component of what is going to be necessary for any of these agricultural carbon credit, ESG markets, et cetera, to work, because farmers have to be able to find a way for cover crops to integrate into their systems so that they can either take the credit themselves or allow Molson Coors to report it for their barley production, et cetera. And the producer-led groups and this program has been a great platform for cross-fertilization, pardon the pun, of these concepts and practices into agricultural communities. And then lastly, we do have at the state level through the DATCAP Soil and Water Resource Program about $6 million that goes out each year statewide to support some of the same practices that a lot of those IRA dollars are going to be funding through the sister programs at the federal level through EQIP RCPP, Conservation Stewardship Program, et cetera. And this map is just a visual to describe how those dollars have been used to increase the amount of nutrient management planning that happens on agricultural operations in the state over time. This is the map from 2021. If you can't read it too closely from your vantage point, dark green is the most coverage, from 75 to 100% of acres being covered under nutrient management plans. So you can see parts of the state that are lower ag, certainly being up in the north woods, but also certain areas that like our Dairy Donut area in the northeast that has really paid a lot of attention to this and taken advantage of some of the state programs to already initiate some of these efforts on their farms. And with that, there was a project that we have been working on. I was a part of helping to advise on the side that Tim was the main author of, and worked very closely with a lot of our legislative partners, agency representatives, which I was one of at the time, to develop this agriculture, carbon, energy, and water initiative. And so I'll pass it back to Tim to go into some of the details of this proposal, what it includes, where it's at today.
I'll be dense and I'll be brief. Last year, there were two bills developed and then submitted for hearing. It was a joint hearing between the Senate and the Assembly on Senate Bill 1054. We call it AQ. Basically, AQ attempted to streamline the process for farming operations to monetize their sustainability efforts. There are four main components to this. One was the development of a carbon accounting system, basically to lower the threshold and the cost of carbon accounting. And the idea was to develop a state voluntary tax form that basically captured, say, 80% of all what every carbon accounting and commercial carbon accounting system out there was asking for, but to do so with 20% of the questions, basically the 80-20 rule. Second was to look at on-farm energy systems. And really the big ask here was to have the State Public Service Commission, have the legislature direct the State Public Service Commission to develop a standardized power purchase agreement that would be used with all transactions between the host facility, this being the farm, and their on-site energy system with their incumbent utility. To have that form just look like a car purchase agreement, a real estate purchase agreement, standard agreements that banks see all the time. And to embed in those agreements a whole bunch of topics, from the net price or the net metered process to the accounting practices to how parallel generation and participation in grid services, include all of that into the standardized agreement. Well, why? Because the utility understands all those topics. The host, if I'm a farm, I am a farmer. I have a solar array on my farm. And if I didn't understand all the different topics involved in the interconnection agreement and the power purchase agreement between me and the utility, I'm at a distinct disadvantage in negotiating favorable terms. So the intent of this bill was to streamline that process, to do the same thing for biogas interconnection, for tolling agreements, biogas standards, and what's necessary for a host of a biogas facility to inject the natural gas originating from that process into the pipeline, because some of the highest value markets are the transportation fuel markets. And what's emerging is the power sector, the industrial sector for processed fuels as well. The third critical leg of this package was to create and facilitate the marketplace for like-minded operations to find each other. Not a big investment, but basically to say, hey, I'm a dairy operator. I buy forage, I buy feed, I buy other inputs. I'm looking at managing my carbon footprint. Who else out there that produces forage, feed, and inputs is willing to do business with me? And we can find each other and adopt similar carbon accounting practices to benefit both parties. And lastly was to explore the carbon labeling world. Carbon labeling is something that will probably be fairly familiar to all of us within a 5-year time frame. That's my prediction. Don't hold me to it. But basically, it'll be part of the ingredient list of any product. This bill was given a hearing. There was a substantial amount of interest. The stakeholders contributing to that hearing were quite impressive and brand names. I fully expect that this bill or a version of this bill will be reintroduced, revised, and discussed in the upcoming session. Next slide, please. The intent was just this, was to allow the farms to develop a baseline and make it simple through a voluntary tax filing. There's been so much changing in carbon accounting that there are probably commercial systems out there now, but even in those commercial systems, the status quo is being challenged. I know of 2 different institutions that are trying to introduce a different approach to carbon accounting other than the World Resource Initiative Institute's Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. We're waiting on the SEC disclosure regulations that will really define what baseline analysis is. That allows the farm to take a look at their current carbon footprint and to work with their processor and said, if I make changes, how am I rewarded? Or on my own, do I have to justify these changes based upon cost savings and other attributes? Next slide, please. The voluntary carbon markets break into 2 different sectors, primarily. One are the publicly traded companies. These are corporate and financial sectors. Banks have really adopted this as a default setting for evaluating supply chain risk. They have taken the information submitted in ESG markets and applied that to credit rating. So it's having a direct impact on the cost of capital for the processing community. To date, the largest and most frequently, we're going to hear from Indigo Ag later on today, and they're one of the leaders in this space, are privately funded practice vendors or carbon market vendors. Next slide, please. One glance tells you ESG has taken a foothold, and the one in the bottom right was actually the leader. Walmart led this effort, has about a 15-year track record, it's substantively for the last 10 years, of developing a supply chain-wide carbon accounting system. But all these others are fairly deep into the space. Next slide, please. This gives you an idea of the various vendors that are involved in land use and practice, carbon vendors. It is a very fluid, growing marketplace. And I expect this to both be larger this time next year and possibly see a fair amount of consolidation. Next slide, please. Let's go through some real basics here. The grower community is targeted. I'm a tree grower and a crop grower. I've been targeted by both. The growers are aggregated. There's a verification standard. That's part of the contracting. The offsets that are generated from that are submitted to registries. And through those registries, once that submittal process is done, they're sold to voluntary buyers. 3 basic concepts involved in almost every one of these soil contracts. 1, additionality, that is something new, so that there's a delta between what's the baseline, what's the new practice, and what's the outcome. Second is permanence, and there's a varying degree of permanence involved here. We heard Brian discuss earlier, voluntary markets are looking at a 40, 30, 25-year time frame. California and some other emerging markets are looking at 100-year permanence. And then there's verification. There's our degrees of self-verification by the information that the farm provides. But in almost all cases, there's a third party involved that may involve on-site, walk in the ground, or may involve satellite imagery or a combination of others. Next slide, please. We're going to provide this a presentation to the participants of the webinar. These are common information. A couple of things to highlight. Benefit stacking. Benefit stacking is, in certain cases, certain private vendors allow you to get equip funding or to get other sources of income from that land. Others do not. And it's really important to make certain that you understand the contractual restrictions on the terms. Second is control of the land. Are there other practices that can be involved on the land besides those defined by the carbon marketer? And I mean, does it allow hunting, fishing, foraging, other activities? I would apply these same contracts to a solar lease. There's all kinds of different terms that are assigned to these environmental attribute and land use practices that your average attorney, local rural attorney, may not be familiar with. So it's important for you, for those of us involved in ag and especially in the farming community, to familiarize ourselves with these things. Next slide, please. World Resource Institute publishes the GHG protocol guidances. And in terms of agriculture, you'll see in the left box, there are the mechanical things. Purchased utility, your machinery, stationary equipment, and then there's the non-mechanical, which tend to be affiliated to tillage practices and the production of crops. With developing a business case for ag, I tend to gravitate to the left and monitor at this point in time what's happening on the right. Because managing my scope 2, which are the fuels and the power and fuels that I buy, have a longer track record and are more defined in terms of the inputs. Because if I put a solar array on my milking parlor, if I can get information on what the change is based upon that solar array and my power consumption, I can quantify that and I can pass that along to my processor. Next slide, please. So in building the business case, there are typically 6 buckets. I work in a world of buckets, in which I look at justification for building that case. Is there a market incentive? Is there an opportunity for me to control costs? As Sara indicated in one of her earlier slides, there's a lot of volatility in input prices. If I've got more control of my input prices because I'm doing a better job at recovering my nutrients or reducing my nutrients or reducing my other soil treatments or my power or fuel costs, it builds to my business case. Can I develop additional revenues? Can I manage my risk? Next slide, please. This is an indicative income statement. I didn't fit it very well in the slide, obviously. But in the first column is your conventional dairy operation. I've got some milk sales, some beef sales. I may sell some grains and some forage, and there may be a lease or two. Let's say there's a hunting lease on there. And then I've got my input costs, my feed, my health, and you can read the rest. If I'm looking at building a business case for sustainable practices, the right column is a guidance here. Does the market respond to my reduction in my carbon intensity? Are they offering me a premium, or are they offering me an ultimatum? I must do them in order to maintain them as a buyer. The yellow cells are additional revenues. Grid services, biogas, nutrient sales, maybe that's more an aspirational goal at this point, and carbon offsets. On the cost side, I may not necessarily be saving money, but if I can find the same input with a lower carbon intensity, it reduces my carbon intensity in my operation. The one exception to that is nobody's going to develop in a power-based system unless they've got a better rate, or at least equivalent to what they're paying right now. Next slide, please. How you use this information is again, illustrated in this slide. One, any practice gets financially modeled on the farm. You still run the numbers. You still do the back of the envelope on the paper. Do the numbers work? Then based upon those options, am I going to put a solar array on my milk parlor? I then need, as if I'm involved in the carbon management aspect on it, I need to determine what are the carbon savings attributed to that option. If I'm putting a solar array, it matches my peak load, and I look at my yield curve, and every installer is going to give you an estimate of that. For my location and that installation and those types of panels, I'm going to generate 60% of my power next year. I'm going to still buy 40% of it from the grid. But now I've got a carbon savings. Now let's say the numbers work good financially. Now I have to determine what I'm going to do with that carbon savings. Am I going to give it to the utility in my power purchase agreement and allow them to take the REC and then sell the REC to somebody else? Or am I going to want that carbon savings and incorporate it internally to meet the carbon intensity goals the processor has set up for me? I got decisions to make. What's most important is having a trusted actuarial platform that provides me guidance. These platforms do not exist in a manner today that are trusted by the commodity finance world. They're beginning to. They're scrubbing data on utility profiles, and every biofuel facility has to file its own carbon intensity data when they sell the ethanol or they sell the bio or renewable diesel. Every kilowatt hour has a carbon footprint, but this is not commonly available. In order for this overall system to work, these place-based, science-based, data-based actuarial tables have to exist. Next slide, please. Because this is the process. If I'm evaluating replacing my grid power with renewable, number one, I got to measure my power buy. Two, I got to understand what the carbon footprint is of that current power buy. Three, then calculate my carbon emissions based upon my power buy. Then evaluate alternatives, calculate the emission sources from those new alternatives, and see what the net effect is. Then once I know what the net effect is, then I have to find a marketplace for that carbon savings. Do I embed it in my own operation, retire it, and reduce my carbon intensity and my reported carbon footprint of my products? Or for a period of time, do I assign it to the utility or some other buyer and said, okay, you can have it for now. You give me a higher price on the power that you're buying back from me, but I reserve the right in 3 years, we have this discussion again. Now, consider that having to do that across the entire space of carbon management opportunities. It's a complex topic. Next slide, please. So I delivered this presentation not quite 2 weeks ago to the Wisconsin Bankers Association. They're ag lenders up in the western part of the state. And what they wanted to understand was their credit risk, developer risk. If farms are approached by developers or the farm itself wants to be the developer, the strength of the team is critical. The priority of the opportunity and the financial impact is critical. And if there's feedstock involved, such as a digester, the feedstock availability of the system is critical. What's the historic product pricing, the liquidity of that inventory? Can I sell my power, my renewable power? Can I do it with a snap? Is there a recognized market, or am I going to have to work at that? Are there policy constraints and hurdles for me to work through that? And lastly, what's the technological risk? Solar PV, silicon-based, not much. It's pretty predictable. But if I'm taking on a more risky one, and Greg Nimitz talked about a whole bunch of novel systems that are emerging, is there a technology risk assigned to that? There's also a number of other things that will be determining that, and that will be federal policies, and we'll address that with the next slide, please. I'm going to let Sara start with the state rules and regulations, but since I got the floor for just a second, you'll notice FERC. FERC is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And they set the regulations for our power sector, primarily at the wholesale level. There are a whole series of rules that are under review and in development right now that will make on-farm systems more attractive, more resilient, and produce more revenue streams. That's a whole day's conversation right now, but envision having a whole bunch of farm systems aggregated and operated in unison as a virtual power plant. And that the manager, be it the renewable electrical co-op, could be the manager, could be the aggregator, could be a private sector party as well, what we call independent power producers, will recruit and aggregate those systems and operate them as one into the grid marketplace, and then share the benefits and share the revenues back to the farm. Now, is that directly tied to the carbon intensity of your milk? It can be. But more importantly, is it distributes the benefit of this grand transition that we're underway to more parties. And I think that's good. Sarah?
Thank you. So yes, the first bullet on the state rules and regulations is very focused on the aspects that Tim talked about, that the proposal that he put forward and worked very closely with the legislature on, and we hope to see a version of again this session, really tries to hit on a lot of those pieces, streamlining that, providing opportunities for some of those templates to be used to deal with some of the energy side of this. But I would say that there's also a lot of opportunity and room for state rules and regulations to be put in place to further incentivize and put structures on the agricultural soil carbon component of all of these systems as well. And even just by ramping up some of the current programs and policies that we have in place right now would be, similarly helpful to ensuring some progress there. The second bullet, I think, is something we just kind of glossed over. Diane got a chance to touch on as well in her talk, but the transparency and the trust that those practices are actually generating a carbon impact is something that is continuing to be a discussion point among researchers across all the sectors, frankly, but certainly making sure that, there's a lot of variability across soil types, agricultural operations, et cetera, for how much carbon can actually be stored in those soils, et cetera. So understanding, having a lot of the research and science behind that to develop that transparency and trust is huge. The outcomes of the USDA demonstration projects, those climate smart commodities in particular, are going to set up a lot of the structures to understand what is a climate smart commodity, what does this climate smart gallon of milk need to look like, and putting some of those parameters on there, I think will initially create some potential confusion across projects on how they look, but I think it will be the onus of the USDA to take some of those demonstration project results and work through, and probably entities like ours too, to assess them and see where that's going. Lastly, I guess I also wanted to, and I'll pass it back to Tim, you can toss some more things in after this, but one of the pieces that you talked about briefly, Tim, it was the stacking of benefits and the potential for IRA funds, for instance, to come in and support the initial implementation of a practice on a farm that can then be also potentially utilized as a carbon credit, or working toward the ESG goals of the processors that commodity is headed toward. And I think that's a really interesting opportunity here too, because as I was trying to allude to early on, is there's a lot of risk on farm in an annual year to farms' crop yields and their margins, then to make sure that they still continue to produce at levels that can obviously bring them in a profit. And so having the opportunity to use the federal funds to work through the implementation phase of incorporating cover crops onto the 100% of a 1,000-acre farm is a big deal, and it's very important to working through those technological issues, having the technical support needed to get over the seasonal hurdles to make sure that you overcome some of those agronomic challenges that will come in with incorporating changes to a pretty dynamic crop management system already is big. And I'm hopeful that a lot of those federal funds can be utilized to make sure that we get this right and that farmers are able to successfully implement carbon sequestering and carbon emission reducing practices. So then that can lead back to that transparency and trust associated with using those practices to sequester carbon and generate that credit, whether it's agricultural soils or some of the technological components that Tim talked about in that enterprise-wide system for carbon management on the farm. Tim.
You know what, Sara, we're at 11:25, and you don't want to give me the floor anymore on on crawling down the rabbit hole on tax credits. But the opportunity is real. The tax credit eligibility and the number of types of projects and who can participate has greatly expanded. Nonprofits, co-ops, municipalities can all participate in this space now. And it's a bit overwhelming to unpack it all, but there's never been a better opportunity to monetize sustainability practices.
Well, and be able to really take, I think, what our level of sophistication and interest, motivation to do a lot of these things in agricultural settings and really move the needle in a really significant way. I'm extremely optimistic about all of these components we've talked about today, similarly what Diane and Brian have and what you hear about through the rest of the afternoon to really move the needle and get to one of the pieces that's near and dear to my heart, which is the co-benefits associated with a lot of entry into carbon management on farms. So with that, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Sara and Tim. That was jam-packed.